was fully briefed on the risks associated with this project, given the age of the building and the land on which it's located. So the risks were very much to do with the unknown ground conditions, which could not be known until the work began, and also the full extent of the condition of the building itself. Once you start opening up these old buildings, you discover all of the issues that you may not know about until you do that. So at that time, the contractor was not prepared to take on all of that risk, given the extent of those unknown factors, and the council agreed to accept those risks directly and to manage those risks. So it's fair to say that this project is arguably maybe the most complex building project in New Zealand at this time, and certainly, as far as I'm aware, the most complex heritage building upgrade or strengthening project. It involves lifting and propping the building to install new base isolators. It involves extensive deep piling and also protecting and restoring the fabric of a Category 1 heritage listed building. We are essentially deconstructing this building, and until you go into the building to see the work going on, it's actually hard to fathom how complex it is. So I would describe the project as dealing with a complex web of risks, and the risks that were anticipated at the outset of the project have actually all eventuated, but they have been significantly amplified over the past 2 years by the impact of a global pandemic, most notably by cost escalations due to supply chain pressure, by inflationary pressure, which is impacting on the construction sector across New Zealand. So this is not the only major projects dealing with cost escalation. The scarcity of construction resource, and significantly perpetual disruption since March 2020, because this project has actually had to experience 4 lockdowns and a restrictive working environment required for the various COVID levels, which exacerbate the situation. That in turn has meant the project has experienced significant delays in construction, and extensive time delays will always lead to higher cost. Also, in terms of time frame, at the outset in 2019, we were aiming for a construction completion date of May 2023. This has now moved out to September 2024, which means with fit out, at the moment we would be planning for a final opening of the town hall fitted out and ready to go in Q1 2025. We're going to be presenting a paper to the Annual Plan Committee next week, which will outline this in more detail and seek approval from you to take a proposition or recommendation to the Council on next steps. But that will involve a request to consider an increase in budget, which we're now going to take you through. But first of all, I'll hand over to Siobhan. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Kia ora, councillors. The project team, I'll just do some introductions before we get started. So the project has an internal governance structure. We have an internal project board. Danny McComb is the chair of that. He heads up the Tinako program of work, of which Town Hall is one of them. I sit on that board, as does Pete Brennan, our property manager. We also have an independent member of that board, Robert Cameron, who is a partner at PwC. And Robert's actually been involved in this project since 2019, since it was approved by council. The project is led by Bede Cristani, who will be known to a lot of you. Bede's with us in the public gallery, as is Nick Clayton from Naylor Love, who's our main contractor on this project. We have a couple of independent advisors, which I'd like to introduce you to. We have Grant Watkins, who is our quantity surveyor, probably the guy with the hardest job in the world in this current environment. We also have Lara Bennett from PwC, and Lara is an executive director at PwC and has been providing project support and assurance and advisory services throughout this project as well. We also have an independent engineer to contract, Bruce McLean. He's not with us today, but Bruce is really responsible for ensuring that any variation in claims that the contractor puts in are verifiable and should be paid, etc. So we've got a very strong project governance and project management team across this project, and have done since 2019. So before we get into the detail, which Danny will take us through, just want to remind ourselves of why we're doing this project. So I'm sure many of us will remember what the town hall looked like and what it gave us as a city. And as you go through this presentation, Danny will highlight some of the photos that have been taken, and you'll really get an appreciation of the fact that we are deconstructing it and having to put it back together. So the key objectives of this is to strengthen a very important Category 1 listed heritage building, which is in the heart of our civic centre. We want to create a world-class venue for performance, and very importantly, we want to create the home of the new National School of Music. And it will become, yet again, a base for civic and community events, and also house council meetings. So that's really why we're doing it. I'll hand over to Danny McComb now, who will take you through the various drivers for the budget increases and the time increases. And then Barbara will wind up with a summary at the end, and then we'll take questions.
Right. Afternoon, councillors. So the first part I wanted to just focus in on just is drilling into the project budget, what it was, where it came from. So Barbara mentioned we had a project budget of 145 million for the project at the outset. That in itself was an increase from the 2018-2028 LTP, where the number was 97 million prior to tender. Through tender, essentially the project was much better understood. There were 3 tenderers, and so the pricing at that point was much firmer, albeit noting all of the risks that Barbara's mentioned, which we'll touch on. So those risks were effectively basically to be picked up through a contingency. 24.3 million was the amount that council approved as the contingency for the project. And that came after looking at a range of potential outcomes, from a low of 9.5 million, and we wish we could be even close to that, to a high extreme position of 34.5 million. So council landed on the 24.3 position as the contingency, and that's what we've been working to since that point in time. A few little sort of add-ons that came on was the mob building, which you'll recall that the mob building is connected to the town hall, and in terms of the town hall project, we needed to remedy the east wall of the mob building, which entailed basically decoupling the buildings and repiling the mob wall, so that if we strengthened mob, we were able to do it knowing that that wall had actually been addressed, and we weren't coming back in and disrupting the town hall. And then some internal costs for project management were added on. So 145 million was basically the budget that we started out with. In terms of the retained contracts, the retained risks, I think before we get into that, it's just useful to reflect on what Siobhan mentioned is the photos. So this is the town hall in its glory, and reflecting on it, we didn't go into this project because the town hall internally was a bad building or anything. It was because it had structural issues. And then when you look at the photo here, this is the same photo basically, saying that's what's happened. So when we talk about deconstructing the town hall to reconstruct it, basically the inside of the town hall has been removed to get the strengthening to be done, to be able to then go back and put the town hall back together again. So at its very simplest level, that's what's going on with this project. So three contract risks that were retained by council. Barbara touched on them quite well, which is basically the work below the ground slab. In terms of that risk, from a contractor perspective, it's an unknown quantity. What you find in that, in terms of underneath, in terms of obstructions, the ground quality, you can do a lot of investigation outside of the town hall, but once you're actually into that ground, that's the ground you're dealing with. The second is that it is a 120-year-old building. In terms of then, there's various places that you're basically not knowing the condition of the building until you're uncovering it. So until you get into the roof and you start stripping the roof back, you don't really know the condition of the roof. And so anything to do with the existing condition and remedying the existing condition of the building was a retained risk for council. Similarly, cost escalation. At the time, this project, the market was still very hot and cost escalation was still a factor, but albeit a factor in the 3 and 4%, where now we're talking about cost escalation in the 7 and 8%, and hopefully a lot higher than that, but there's still risk around cost escalation. So the cost escalation is basically, it's a formulaic calculation that looks at the indices around construction and says, what has that indice moved, and therefore what does the contract price move by to reflect that? So those 3 risks were basically the contract risks retained by council. In addition to that, within the contract, there are a range of cost estimates, and that's where basically the contractor and the project team have had their best estimate at what the cost of those may well be. Provisional sums, there's something like 77 provisional sums ranging from $1,000 up to $250,000. So it covers a lot of things where you just don't have enough detail at that time to accurately cost them. So you've got 77 provisional sums and they total just over $4 million. Contamination is essentially throughout that building. We know that there's asbestos in the building. Hard to know the extent of it, hard to know the cost of fixing it until you know the extent of it. So contamination was another one that had an estimate in the budget for the cost to be discovered as and when those contaminations were dealt with. We mentioned in-ground obstruction, so that's the work that would then basically interfere with the piling process. Temporary works, pile lengths is basically, again, it's you have an estimate of how deep you think the piles are going to go until you actually put them in and the piles meet the set resistance that you want. You don't know how deep those piles have to go. So again, it's an estimate. Temporary works is essentially, temporary works is all of this stuff. It's all of the support structures that are keeping the building safe. So if you think about the town hall, the reason we're doing this is because it was a 15% of code or something like that. It was an unsafe building, and so then you go into basically work within an unsafe building and you're deconstructing it, you're making it even more unsafe. So the temporary works is around making sure that the building is properly supported to provide a safe environment for all of the workers and all of the people on site. The design methodology is really around that the final design was not fully resolved and wouldn't be resolved until you exposed various parts of the building and worked out some of the methodologies around how you were going to do your piling, how you were going to move on to your base isolator. So there's a lot of design work that still had cost estimates against it. Dewatering is really around the fact that as we go into the auditorium, we're going below the water table. And so going below the water table, we're then exposed to how much water comes into the site from either rainfall events or from tides or whatever. So it's effectively that cost of how do you manage that and get the construction project working. And then the last one is the extent of work around heritage. So a lot of the heritage is in things like the pressed metal ceilings, it's in the tiles on the floor, and again, until you get into those, difficult to know what the cost of actually taking them out, putting them in, and repairing what damage has been done to them over time and during the process. So those are cost estimates that we retain the risk on. So they have dollar provisions, but it's whether the dollar provisions are sufficient to cover the cost of those items. The last one is sort of the mystery box of what I've called unforeseen risks. So COVID-19, as Barbara explained, 2 years, lots of lockdowns. The impact on COVID-19, I think Nick will tell you that it's hard to maintain momentum on a building site where you're continually disrupted. So effectively you get a head of steam, then you're down, you're trying to get it back up, you're down. So COVID has significant impacts on the project, and no one anticipated those, to be brutally honest. Supply chain disruption, some of that's a factor of COVID, but some of it's also a factor of that the New Zealand construction market is very, very much out of balance. There's more basically construction going on that the supply chain can keep up with and manage. So on other projects, we're seeing staples that you would just normally rely on, jib board not being available, 4x2 timber not being available. These are things that you normally just go down and you can pick up at any time. That's not the case anymore. And so you've got quite a difficult supply chain that you're trying to manage through this project. Some of the emerging stuff is not necessarily impacting us, but I think it sort of points to why we're in the situation around risk sharing that we are. So some of the things that we're seeing, business failures like the Armstrong Downs recent, is around contractors who've taken on fixed price contracts and the risks are shedding home to the contractor. So if we looked at this project and we look at the sort of number we're talking about here of a $30-odd million variance to our budget, if you applied that to the type of margins that a contractor will typically make on a contract, it dwarfs them. So if those risks were taken on by the contractor, there's probably not a contractor in New Zealand who could sustain those types of cost increases versus what they actually make from managing a contract. So what that then comes to is our three risk categories: the contract retained risks, the cost estimates, and the unforeseen risks. What we have to manage those is the contingency. So the 24.3 million that we mentioned in the budget, that's our dollar figure to manage those risks. Everything else is largely accounted for. And hopefully you can see this clearly enough, but essentially the first column is our budget, the 145.3. We're roughly just about halfway through the project, give or take, and we've spent about 60% of the total budget to date. So at this point, you're saying it's looking okay, not too bad. But if we look at the contingency line, what we can see is we're halfway through the budget. We've spent almost all of our contingency already. And that whilst we have plenty of budget to carry on work next year, we are going to hit a point where we effectively don't have the funding to carry on and complete the project. So essentially the issue really is around that, how are we funding the risks that we've retained as council? So essentially I mentioned we had costs allocated or budgets allocated to each of those items, and effectively this basically is looking at how have they played out, and you can see the two big ones have played out. The in-ground conditions, we're 250% of what we had as the cost estimate, so quite a significant increase of 4.5 million. The temporary works, again, 220% increase, so again another major increase on that. And then the other one to note down there is time. We're pretty much spent on time, and we've still got lots of time risk in the project. So effectively all this is really saying is some areas we've actually crystallised some of this risk and the costs have come in, but where the costs have come in higher, that means we've got even less provision to fund the other risks that are still coming through. So where we've got things that are at the likes of dewatering, we're close to budget. We haven't really started the dewatering yet, so those risks are still to be transpired. So just looking at then saying, well, now we've got a picture of what we budgeted and where we are in terms of our spend to date. This is now looking at where have we still got risk and where have we still got funds to apply to various things. So piling, we're not too bad in that we've spent a lot of the contingency already. The piling now, our risk on piling is now limited to finishing the auditorium. So not as complex as the previous piling, and a lot of lessons learned from the previous piling experience. Dewatering, I mentioned that dewatering we have yet to do. Dewatering will be in relation to basically, again, the auditorium. That's where we go into the ground below the water table. And certainly the cost expectation on the dewatering, there's only one contractor. It's looking more complex than originally thought, and so that cost is looking to be quite a bit higher than the original provision of $500,000. Building condition and design, we're miles out on that, and that really reflects the fact that when we've got into the building, it just isn't in very good condition in a lot of places. The level 1 floor was basically unsound and had to be propped and relaid. The roof trusses are in bad shape, and so a lot of remedial work required on the roof trusses, and a lot of that requires redesign as well. Heritage, we haven't spent a lot, but heritage will come at the end. It's largely around the fit out or the fitting back of the building rather than the construction. So we're really still in the construction phase of the project itself. Cost escalation is a massive one for us, and whilst it looks quite positive at the moment, 2.4 million, that's the settlement of the first 2 years of cost escalation. So that's your 3 or 4%, which are more closer to the norm we were expecting. The ongoing ones are your 6 and 7 and 8% cost escalations. So that impact is really to come and hit us yet, and that we're seeing it in our forecast, but not in our actual costs at the moment. And then we have time, which is just around that as soon as the program takes longer, time has a cost. And so effectively moving from the May 2023 to September 2024, we've got significant time costs associated with that. Other really picks up the fact that a lot of these works require consultant input, whether it's engineers, whether it's architects, whether it's grant on costings. So there's, as you increase the works, you also increase the support costs that live with the consulting team. So weighing those up, from where we are in terms of our spend to date, we're at 23 million, and we believe that we need 33.4 million additional contingency to complete the project. We'll touch on the fact that that's an estimate, and there are still residual risks to the project. So I would hate to go away with anyone thinking that that's an exact number and there's an exact science sitting behind it. So overall, putting that together, essentially we're looking at a cost increase to complete of 37.1 million, which is the 33 of the contingency. It's 2.7, which is largely internal costs and professional fees to support the project team, and a bit of extra cost on the internal labour charges. So that's our effective projected cost to complete, 182.4 million, compared to our original budget, 145.3. Look, options are not really particularly palatable, in that we don't really have any options, to be honest, and that we've got to finish the building. The scope of works is pretty defined, and it's not a project where we can reduce or change scope. The scope is quite limited. It's strengthening and restoring the heritage building, so there's not a lot of scope. Value engineering, the team have done value engineering right through, and I think through COVID, the Naylor Love team have been fantastic in keeping the site going and making sure that effectively the program was still being delivered even through quite challenging times. So options, and they're here for completeness rather than for reality, to be honest. So the stop the project, it's an option, but we can't really. And what would you have? You'd have a half-built heritage building that would be difficult to demolish. We have contractual obligations to Naylor Love. We have lease agreements to Victoria University, and also the NZSO. And then you've got effectively a half-finished building that would be difficult to demolish. So our options really are, effectively, apart from the funding issue, is to maintain good project disciplines on the site. I think one of the pleasing things from the board perspective is seeing the culture that is evident across the project. So the way the Naylor Love team work with the consultant team, work with Bede's project management team, I think that's a very constructive, positive relationship, and they seek to solve problems which basically are in this project. Basically there's challenges every day to be solved. So in terms of options then, not a hell of a lot to do, and effectively we're looking to say, well, our option really is that we need the additional funding to complete the project. We touched on some of the key milestones, and so as we sort of talk about, we took on a hell of a lot of risk at the outset for council. What risks do we still have, and how are those risks playing out? So there are three basic elements of the project that still carry significant risk, and our risk to council will reduce as we get through each of these milestones. So the first one is February 2023, so not that far away. And that's really when the building moves on to its base isolators. At that point, the building's much sounder, and a lot of the temporary works and those types of things that are causing us a hell of a lot of cost angst are starting to resolve themselves. Then in terms of March 2023, then we're starting to come out of the piling risks. So at that point, all of those in-ground risks of pile lengths, of contamination in ground, of obstructions in ground, we're out of that area. And then in January 2024, we're basically completing the auditorium basement. So all of that stuff around dewatering, contamination, and again, underground works, it all starts to basically crystallise. And as we move through that, our risks are reducing. So they're not disappearing, and we still have the unknown risks around, will COVID do anything? Will it continue? Will it accelerate? What's happening in the market in terms of cost escalation, what's happening to the supply chain, and what's happening to other people in the market. So a good example here is that at Takina, we had the supplier of the operable walls has gone into liquidation. So we're quite lucky that the operable walls had arrived, but it's by the grace of God, these sorts of things, to be honest. So as we then look to our completion dates of September 2024, and then hopefully the building opening, as Barbara mentioned, first quarter of 2025. So the gap is really, it's about your fit out of your tenants and your commissioning of the tenants' works. So at this point, I'll pass back to Barbara to basically provide a summary.
Thank you, Danny. And once I've undertaken this summary, I'm sure you'll have questions. Look, I think Danny has done a very good job of explaining to you the extent of the complexity and risk management effort for the town hall. We have the convergence here of arguably the most complex heritage building upgrade in New Zealand, in a seismically challenged city on reclaimed land, with an unprecedented, a word very overused at the moment, I know, but unprecedented global pandemic. And while we could anticipate at the outset of this project that there would be risks that were very difficult to describe in terms of cost that would be uncovered as the work commenced, we couldn't have predicted a global pandemic, and it's very difficult with this complex web of risks to unpick it to the extent we can tell you exactly which bit the pandemic has caused and exactly which bit these pre-known conditions have caused. But the end result is, the reality is, despite what I would describe as excellent project management oversight and ongoing independent advice from the outset of the project and throughout the governance of the project, and indeed the preparation of this advice to you today, the reality is, to complete this project, we have to confront an unpalatable $37.1 million increase in budget. And we just need to lay out the facts to you and to the public very clearly so that everybody understands the reasons for that. I probably don't need to repeat to you the risks that Danny has gone through. You can see them there. We should remember, though, that this is not unique to Wellington, that you will be reading about other major projects in New Zealand delivered by both public and private sector organisations facing very challenging cost pressures. The thing with our project is it's 2 years into the building, and it has been really having to deal with the pandemic from the very beginning and throughout, and that's made it particularly difficult. In terms of the impact of this budget request, it isn't going to impact on your annual plan budget in the coming year. These are costs that are going to apply in the following 2 years and will need to be recognised in your longer term financial plan and in the phasing and refocusing of our capital works program. And this is advice that we will bring to you through the annual plan LTP committee and then on via a recommendation from that committee to the council. And of course that meeting is on the 1st of June. So I think the final point I will make is I think it's very important that Danny has mentioned this is not an exact science. The team have done a lot of work in preparing this advice for you in trying to anticipate the risks yet to be realised, as well as the risks that have already been realised and have impacted on our contingency. And we've tried our best to advise you on an increase in budget that we hope will be sufficient, and we plan to be sufficient. But there is little further value engineering to do to change this situation, because the real costs are in the structural upgrade. They're not in things that you might term nice to haves. So these are the essential pieces of work that need to be done to ensure we open a safe and beautiful town hall for the enjoyment of all. Thank you. So we have a great team here of experts who can answer any questions.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and then I have Sarah, Fleur, and then I see Nicola, you've put your hand up as well. My first question is actually for Robert Cameron, who's joining us from PwC, just to get your independent view on this, which is...
We don't have Robert here.
Oh, we don't have Robert here?
No. We've got Lara.
Lara here.
Yes.
Lara. Thank you, Lara. Lara, I guess your independent view is, have we dropped the ball here? Is if we'd performed better, and we being either councillors or staff or our contractors, if we'd performed better, could these costs have been avoided?
Look, as you may have heard, we undertook some work at the very beginning of this project, and then at that time it was recognised there was a great deal of uncertainty. It is a very complex project. That hasn't changed. We also undertook a project health check in the middle of last year, and for context, a project health check is not a diagnostic tool to find fault or illness. It's there to sort of verify the current project status and look for opportunities on the go forward if there's any way to improve outcomes on the project. Our findings in that independent health check, I'll just reiterate what Danny said earlier, there is a very strong collaborative culture among the delivery teams on this project between the contractor, the consultants and the council team themselves, and they are all working to get a best for project outcome. They're very engaged. There are a lot of complexities that come up on a day-to-day basis. So the one thing we did note in our health check is because of those day-to-day complexities that were having to be dealt with, it was difficult for the project team to be able to look forward too far into the future. We don't believe that would necessarily have changed any of the outcomes, and we're operating in a very resource-constrained construction environment. So it's not like you can say, oh, I'd like another 5 people in this specialist area on the job and they're all standing around waiting to work. The team has done everything they can to mitigate that, and they've also put some additional initiatives in place over the course of the project and in recent times as well, such as using digital tools to enable the team to see what things look like in a 3D modelling, from a 3D modelling viewpoint. Not my area of expertise, but somebody knows there, and a lot of other mitigations. There is constant effort to mitigate the risks. You're never going to eliminate them. So overall, I think the team is doing the best job you can. You will never have a perfect outcome.
Thank you, Lara. Barbara, did you want to comment before we move on?
No, look, I think it's important you hear that independent view.
Thank you. Then I'll move on to Deputy Mayor Free.
Thank you. One of the things I think I've been impressed with is the health and safety culture, which has probably made it more complicated as well. But do you have any concerns at all about the health and safety record on site? How's it been?
I think it's been exemplary. I think Naylor's been getting results of not over 95% most times, most months, and they're doing a great job. Obviously, the amount of temporary works and risk management that is going into the project has helped immensely.
And my second question is just around the size and scope of the project, and it having been perhaps the most complex project nationally at the minute. Are we going to be able to celebrate that and kind of put in for some sort of award when it's wonderfully and finally finished?
I certainly think we could.
Good. Let's keep that forefront, and thank you, Siobhan, for the positive way in which you actually introduced the project and the big why we are doing this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Fitzsimons.
Yeah, thanks for the honest and warts and all presentation. I guess my question is really about the risk that what's happened at the town hall also happening at the Central Library. So it's very nearby. How much analysis and thought have we given to that?
So I can answer that, and Danny can pitch in as well. They're quite different projects. They're quite different buildings. So the town hall was built in the 1900s. The library was built late 1980s. The ground conditions are very different as well. So the library is sitting on bedrock. The town hall has got very variable ground conditions, which make it very, very difficult and made the piling extremely difficult. We're also working through the design. We've engaged a contractor early in the process, so we do have a contractor on board already who's working through the design and will be involved in developing the detailed design as well. So there are quite significant differences, but that's not to say that we won't see, when we get to the detailed design stage, that we see some of these risks eventuating. At the moment, the project is working within its budget, so I'm not going to promise that it will stay there, because obviously the more you find out through that design process, the more it will inform your risk position.
Cool, and my second question really is a little bit like Jenny's initial question, but it's a bit different as well. I think you've done a really good job of explaining the situation and the problem that we face, and I agree, there isn't really a choice. But I guess I am interested, as experts who've been working on this project for a long time, what lessons or reflections are there for the city that we should take from this? Because I know that I'm thinking we need to have a different approach to heritage in the future. We can't keep adopting this kind of approach, but I'm really interested in your expert opinion about potentially what we could have done differently at the start and what we might learn from this going forward.
Thank you, Councillor. No one's ever called me an expert before, so thank you.
It's relative.
Yes. Look, I think the lessons, and there's similar lessons to the St James as well, to be honest, and the Basin Reserve Museum, which is another heritage building, is that you are dealing with old buildings, and the more you try to do to the old buildings, it's very difficult to understand the risk profile when you go into those projects. You are basically on, to some extent, a mission of discovery. So when we went to the St James, effectively we discovered that walls were joined to previous building walls, and you just don't know that. You don't expect it. It's not what's on the as-built plans. So these projects do basically throw up a hell of a lot of surprises to you. And I think the lessons for council is when you're looking at some of the other buildings we still have, the likes of Mob, the likes of the Bond Store, the likes of the Opera House, is that you have to face up the fact that these buildings are complex. And so I think your budget expectations have to have a sufficient risk value added to them to really account for what that is. So I think that the lessons are you can't do enough investigation up front, but you can't avoid the risks that you're taking on board as well.
Do you think there's also oh no, you go.
Yeah, if I could just add to that I've been a QS in Wellington for 33 years now, and the bringing together of all of the constraints at one particular time, including a pandemic, which we didn't foresee in 2016 when I started on this project. But, you can't... you can't say enough about that they've all come together. We've got a perfect storm situation at the moment, and it's going to hang around for a bit longer yet. So.
And I might just add onto the top of that, going back again to the culture that's been built around this project, it's not a lesson learnt on this project, because the project at the start went in with that approach. It knew that a collaborative culture in such a complex environment was essential to getting the best outcome. And I think taking that forward into other projects is also the same thing. It's incredibly important to build that culture right at the outset.
So just thinking about that kind of perfect storm, I guess I'm interested, do you think as a city we really need to have a different approach to heritage and where we spend our money, particularly seeing the earthquake strengthening challenges facing so many buildings in Wellington now? Do you think we need to change the priority that's placed on heritage in some instances?
No, I would make a broader comment than that. I would say that the way in which we are improving the process of planning and enabling sufficient time in advance of any major project, whether it be a heritage building or not, is the important skill, because quite often in local government, with the strategic planning processes we're required to undertake under the Local Government Act, we find ourselves anticipating projects 3 years and 10 years in advance, well before any detailed planning and discovery can be undertaken, and that then sets up public expectations and expectations of councils to deliver projects within certain budgets, within certain timeframes, when in fact what we all need to develop is a culture of understanding that you need to take a staged approach to projects and recognise that the first stage is the planning and discovery, and that hasty projects are often the ones that create the greatest risks. Now, in this case, I do not believe haste has anything to do with it. I think this is unique, this particular project, given the circumstances we have described and the perfect storm that we are in. But I think we are becoming more mature as an organisation in the way we manage our assets, the way we manage our significant projects and programs, the way we forecast our financial requirements, and that's what I would recommend is most important.
Thank you, Councillor Fitzsimons. Councillor Young, I've seen you've taken your hand down, so I'm going to go on to Councillor Pennant.
Only because Councillor Fitzsimons has asked my questions.
Excellent.
Thank you, Councillor Conde, and thank you, staff, for all your amazing work on this really important building. So 3 questions. One is, how is this going to be publicly communicated? Because, of course, the headline will be massive blowout.
So can I say, first of all, that this briefing is being live streamed?
Sorry. I was a little bit late coming in. Okay, great. Yes. So people know that. Okay,
yes,
cool.
So it's being live streamed, and we have made a media release, and we are providing the media with an opportunity to have more time with us.
Okay, great. Second question is, just given the quantum of the costs, I guess what is the opportunity cost? Because there's some stuff we might not be able to do. Or would you not agree with that?
Look, I might ask our CFO, Sarah Hay, to comment on the overall capacity.
Kia ora, Iona. We know that there will be pressure on the capital program for lots of reasons, increased costs, inflation, and so Council has a couple of opportunities to address that. So you'll see what that view looks like through the annual plan, long-term plan process. But then when we come to Council with the carry forwards from this year, I'm making the assumption that there will be carry forwards, you get to do that exercise as you did this year, looking at the full 10 years, so how we might mitigate and manage some of that risk and address some of those issues. So there's always phasing, prioritisation, and other methods that you can choose to consider as Council.
Okay. Last question. Of course, as a heritage advocate, I regret it when heritage becomes a whipping boy, because we've got, in fact, I've been talking to media about this today, there's 600 buildings which are earthquake prone. It's not just heritage buildings. So I guess just building on Fleur's question, are we going to do some more thinking about where we do prioritise our spend in terms of our infrastructure, including our buildings, or do we just need a good policy rethink when we finally present our heritage policy of saying, well, look, actually, some of these things do need to be prioritised, bearing in mind that we decided unanimously not to demolish the heritage, the town hall. It just would have been too difficult. So, and we were warned that the cost would go up as well. Thanks.
So your question is around, should we be prioritising our infrastructure spend, bearing in mind the earthquake-prone nature of buildings across the city?
Yeah, just about everything that we've got to prioritise, including owners who've got homes which are prone as well, and just really whether there can be some thinking about how that's done carefully, obviously.
So we are doing some thinking around our role as advocates for. We have our regulatory function, so that's quite separate. We have the regulatory earthquake-prone building function that we are running, but there is also a function that we need to probably improve in terms of our advocacy to central government around the regulations and legislation that we fall under as a regulator as well. So there is some thinking that we're doing in that space. In terms of prioritising our spend, I think our long-term plan gives us that opportunity every 3 years where we have our strategic priorities, and then we come to council and you basically agree or don't agree, or you prioritise where that spend should be. There are some essentials, obviously, that we, in terms of our roading and water infrastructure, but I think we need to continue to be led by strategic priorities in terms of where we're prioritising spend.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pennant. I've got Councillor Calvert next, and then Mayor Foster.
Thank you. On the vein of following on from heritage, I mean, the way I look at Wellington's faced a very slow quake, not a big sudden quake because of all the issues, and the town hall manifests that because what we've seen in how not only the problems but with building codes and the impact on the city. Has there been any representation to government, not just on about the town hall, but the overall impacts and what has been the result of that?
Councillor Calvert, yes, there has. You might recall we raised this issue and identified it in our briefing to incoming ministers at the beginning of this government's term. At an officials level, we have had conversations with officials in central government about the impact of the challenge, the seismic resilience challenge for all building owners in the capital city. The impact on both private homeowners and also commercial building owners collectively is a matter that is a priority for us to further discuss with you and how we might take that conversation forward. But absolutely, yes, those discussions have been happening.
Okay, so no sort of, I suppose at this stage there's no insight from government in terms of understanding our unique position?
Look, no, it's a conversation at the moment because, this is a nationwide challenge too. But of course, Wellington has a particularly challenging seismic environment, and we have a CBD that has, at least very large areas of it have been built on reclaimed land.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Calvert. Mayor Foster.
Thanks, Chair. So a couple of areas of questions for me. The first one was just, can you tell us a little bit more about what we're seeing in other projects across the board? Now, you've touched on the differences with, for example, the library, etc., but in the market generally, so we're both public and private sector, and what experiences people are having there.
Yeah, it's very similar. This is certainly not an isolated case. Escalation is rampant at the moment, and couple that with supply issues around the global supply issues, the amount of work that's going on locally and nationally. It's an extreme situation, so it's likely to continue for a little while yet too.
When you say it's an extreme situation, you mean it's an extreme situation across the board, not just the town hall being an extreme situation?
That's correct. Correct.
Yeah, okay, cool. No, thank you. Second one is just in terms of, we talked with the library about early contractor involvement. Would early contractor involvement have helped, and if so, to what degree with this kind of project where it's a bit more of a voyage of discovery than the library was?
Yeah, we got contractor involvement early on this project in terms of programming and also understanding of the building. We decided to run down the detailed design process and get it right the way through to full design information before going to tender. And I think that worked really well. We have got a large component of this project as a fixed price, albeit that's subject to cost fluctuation, but it would have been anyway. I think if we'd had ECI, it would have been very difficult to have subcontractors pricing the project at an early stage with less than detailed design information.
That's what I figured, which is why I asked the question. Okay, and look, the final area of question is just in terms of the things which are particularly the market breaking effectively post the arrival of COVID. I know that there were some bits around steel and scaffolding and just the cost escalation, which Danny did mention the cost escalation one. But what are the areas where you'd actually say this is specifically COVID has particularly hit them, either the market or the project in terms of shutdowns, etc., and quantifying those?
Ooh, yeah, COVID's a tricky one. It sort of muddies the water in all the aspects of the project. It's certainly hindered productivity on site, and there's been a definite drop in motivation as well because they're just not getting through the work as fast as they could otherwise. That's nothing against Naylor Love on this aspect, but it's just a function of the guys on site. And supply chain issues around the world, which we have no control over. It's a real issue.
I think adding to that, if you talk about the supply chain, and we talk about it a lot, about affecting the market and this project, it isn't just the material supply chain, it's the supply of labour. We've had border closures where you'd normally have specialists coming in and out of the country. That's not been able to happen. It just puts more and more pressure on the resources domestically, and that's being felt market-wide. So there's so much constraint on the resources that are available out there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Foster. I've got one more for Barbara probably, although it would be better if Liam was in the room, but acknowledging he's not here. With the district plan coming up, and I guess I'm just, following on from Councillor Fitzsimon's question about do we need to think differently about heritage protections based on the lessons we've learned on the expense and complexity and challenges of these kinds of projects. Can we get some more advice about the heritage protections that are going to be in the proposed district plan and about whether they're striking a good balance between the pragmatism of sometimes needing to demolish because of the expense of these projects?
Yes, we can give you that advice. It is a complex one because we also have an independent body, New Zealand Heritage, taking an interest also, particularly in our Category 1 heritage buildings. They of course, are very interested in the Town Hall project, but also in Te Matapihi, as you know. The reality is, whether a heritage building or not, we want our buildings ultimately to comply with building code, and we want our buildings to be safe for people. And I think you need to treat every question, every building as an independent case. So case by case, you weigh up the risks, the options, the alternatives, as we did, for example, for the mob building versus the town hall, versus the Te Matapihi. And of course, the public will also have very strong views about what they value in terms of, the city's history. So it's very difficult to have one sweeping answer for all, but we are very happy to give you further advice and to discuss that with you.
Thank you, Barbara. Councillor Pennant, if you're quick, you can be the last question.
Thank you. Well, now I feel I had to ask a question on the back of yours, Councillor Condie. I hope also that we will get some advice around very tall multi-storey buildings and the earthquake strengthening costs around those. As you know, I have huge concerns around the cost to owners too of building very high dense buildings, and the costs are astronomical. So just that it's a balanced view over business and homeowners and heritage would be appreciated if you provide any further advice. And obviously I'm meeting with staff to discuss this issue too, so hopefully we can come back with some answers through that too. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pennant. And I just want to wrap this up by thanking everyone for all the work that's going into this project and into this briefing, bringing us up to speed today. Grant and Lara, thank you for being here today, and all our friends from Naylor Love who are working on this project, and also our staff, Danny and Bede, Siobhan. Just thank you for everybody who's working really hard on this project. It's clear how complex it is. Some of this engineering is really cutting edge. I understand some of it's the first time we've ever done it anywhere in the world. So it's really exciting to see the innovation happening in Wellington while we sit there alongside of the fact that we're dealing with a really challenging project environment, and that means that we're having to work really hard on these cost escalation pressures. So I just wanted to acknowledge and thank you all for your work and for the collaborative problem-solving culture that it sounds like you've developed. We're really lucky to have that attitude coming onto this project, and we appreciate you all. All right, thank you, councillors. We'll see you later.